Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad, conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión
Muy bien. Muy buenas tardes a todos, a todas, a los que están aquí en la audiencia y a quienes nos siguen también en la transmisión de YouTube. Es un placer estar con ustedes esta tarde. Mi nombre es Sergio Celis, yo soy académico de la Escuela de Ingeniería y Ciencias y soy investigador responsable del proyecto Fondesit que llamamos PhD Boundaries, o el mapeo de los bordes de la educación doctoral. Y en este proyecto nuestra intención es explorar 3 bordes de lo que entendemos por la educación de los doctores y las doctoras en Chile, que son los bordes nacionales, geográficos, territoriales. Ese es un nivel. El segundo son los bordes que tienen que ver dónde realizamos nuestra labor, nuestra investigación, nuestro trabajo y cómo vamos cruzando el sector educacional, privado, público. Y el tercer nivel tiene que ver con los bordes disciplinarios. Todos bordes que están en cuestión en estos días. Y también creemos que esto es importante hacerlo desde Chile, donde el sector de educación doctoral ha crecido mucho en la última década, y donde también se está haciendo una educación doctoral desde el sur. Y creemos que eso no le da, además de darle una cierta calidad a esta discusión de los bordes, también creemos que es un aporte original que hacemos desde acá a la creación de conocimiento a nivel mundial y que debemos explorarla, debemos estudiarla, debemos cuestionarla más para entender cuál es nuestra posición también en el mundo y cómo estamos formando a los futuros científicos y a las futuras personas que van a liderar cambios en todos los niveles de nuestra sociedad. Y, por supuesto, si vamos a hablar de educación doctoral, un punto de partida es preguntarse quiénes son las personas que son invitadas, que son llamadas a seguir esta educación de posgrado, y ahí el tema de la inclusión nos parece inevitable. Este es un trabajo que hemos hecho en conjunto con mis compañeras del proyecto. Aquí está la profesora Daniela Belli de la Universidad Católica, la profesora Karina Guzmán de la Universidad de Tarapacá y la profesora Isabel Hilliger de la Universidad Católica. También juntos hemos tratado de abordar esto y queremos también que el tema de la equidad y la inclusión sea un sello también en nuestro trabajo, en nuestra investigación. Así que por eso es el tema que nos convoca hoy, y para darnos unas palabras de bienvenida voy a invitar a nuestra directora de posgrado y postítulo de la Universidad de Chile, la profesora Laura Gallardo, para que nos dé unas palabras iniciales.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Para nosotros, como Departamento de Posgrado y Postítulo, you following, more or less? Yes, good. Es un agrado estar con ustedes hoy día acá, con la profesora Posselt, y hablar de este tema de inclusión. Pero antes de proceder a eso, yo quisiera darle las gracias a Sergio y sus co-investigadoras en este proyecto Fondesit, porque hace varios meses atrás, yo diría que casi más tiempo, ¿no? Empezamos como el año pasado. Empezamos a discutir una colaboración a través de este proyecto con el Departamento de Posgrado y Postítulo, y ha sido muy beneficioso para nosotros, así que estamos muy contentas y contentos con este trabajo. Y dentro de eso, bueno, tenemos el privilegio de contar contigo, con la profesora Posselt, quien nos va a hablar de inclusión, un tema que por supuesto en nuestro posgrado, en nuestro pregrado por cierto, pero en el posgrado también es de enorme importancia. Los talentos están en todas partes y queremos tener a esos talentos para la investigación y la creación presentes. Entonces tenemos que ir descubriendo las maneras de poder identificarlos y hacer más fácil la vida de esas personas dentro de nuestros posgrados y también del pregrado. Así que, sin más, quiero dar la bienvenida a la profesora Posselt, que nos va a hablar a través de su larga trayectoria en torno a los temas de inclusión y equidad. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Bueno, y ahora tengo el placer de introducir a una estimada colega y amiga, la profesora Julie Posselt. Es un verdadero honor tenerla aquí con nosotros hoy día, tenerla aquí en Chile a discutir estos temas. No voy a leer todos los méritos ni galardones, pero solo darle alguna referencia de quién es la profesora Posselt. Ella es profesora asociada de la Universidad de Southern California, de la Rossier School of Education. Es presidente de la Asociación de Sociología de la Educación y también es actualmente vicedecana de la Escuela de Posgrado de la Universidad de Southern California. Ella ha trabajado por bastante tiempo el tema de cómo las inequidades se han institucionalizado, se institucionalizan en educación superior y cómo también la educación superior es capaz de hacer cambios en ellas. Ella es una experta en las dinámicas de toma de decisiones y de cómo podemos hacer el tema de la inclusión y el acceso a avanzar en la academia. Es reconocida internacionalmente, ha recibido muchos galardones en su carrera y también está en los directorios de varias revistas de primer nivel en educación superior. Ella es doctora en educación superior de la Universidad de Michigan y también posee un postdoctoral fellowship en la National Academies of Education y la Spencer Foundation. Así que sin más, saludo también a nuestra rectora o president, Rosa Debes. Mucho gusto, qué bueno que nos acompañe, Rosa. Sabemos que estos temas son muy importantes para ti. Y ahora les voy a dejar con Julie. Su presentación va a ser en inglés, así que espero que puedan seguirla. Después vamos a tener un pequeño momento para preguntas y comentarios. Lo pueden hacer en español y nosotros ayudamos en esa traducción, no hay problema, lo vamos haciendo entre todos, podemos ayudar y entender mejor. Así que, sin más, Julie, thank you very much for being with us today, for meeting us and sharing your knowledge with all of us today. Please come.
Buenas tardes. Today I'm honored to join you from Los Angeles, California. And both of those places, Los Angeles and California, are beautiful and unequal. Los Angeles is unique in being one of the most dynamic, creative cities in the world. We can argue whether Santiago or Los Angeles is more dynamic and vibrant. We could argue whether California or Chile is more dynamic and vibrant, but people compare them all the time in Los Angeles. Similarly, what I feel is important to start by saying is that we inhabit those contradictories, that life can be both beautiful and unequal, that places can be both wonderful and painful at the same time. And my hope is to be able to share with you a little bit today about a way that I have been working and a way that I have been researching that I hope will give a sense of encouragement and sense of possibility to those of you who are committed to creating more equitable opportunities for the future of higher education in Chile and beyond. So my work is inspired by the tensions that are present in many places within higher education. Whether the tension is between beauty and inequality, between merit and diversity in my first book, between the tensions of representation and culture in my second book, or between the possibilities of administration that can be done with an eye to social justice, I feel pretty confident that it's not in choosing between pure values and realities of difficulty, but in finding ways to resolve those tensions and act in small, meaningful ways within the spheres of influence that each of us hold. As each of us progress in our education and as we progress in our careers, we begin to get opportunities to make small, important differences in daily spaces. And that is the work of culture. And I am confident that whether you are a student today, as I know Connie is, whether you are a professor like Sergio, or whether you are a president, that you have an opportunity for creating influence by how you manage the tensions between what is difficult and what is possible. So the words on the screen today, some of you may recognize, they're by Paulo Freire. Nosotros hacemos el camino caminando. We make the road by walking. And I want to start with that idea because I have found it to be so true that as we are walking toward and helping to create a more equitable system of higher education, there are not perfect scripts for us in how to do this. We literally are writing the story of how to do this as we go. But that first word, nosotros, or we, is critical. I am absolutely persuaded that we can do more together than we can on our own. We are stronger together, we are smarter together, we are more courageous together. And so it definitely does begin with developing a strong sense of we. With the time that I have, I want to start with some definiciones compartidas, some shared definitions about concepts that I think are really critical to this conversation. I will then move into talking a little bit about the importance of connecting our values and our practices, because I think often it's in the mismatch between values and practices that we see those tensions that I talked about. I'll then share a little bit about change efforts in the United States that I've had the privilege to be a part of, and then close with a little bit about some of the results and implications for making the road. And I hope that whether you are somebody who is directly working on graduate education, or whether you are somebody who is thinking about knowledge production, or whether you are thinking about other aspects of higher education, that the ideas of how to do social change by making the road by walking will be useful. I will mention, if you have not already read the book, We Make the Road by Walking, Nosotros Hacemos el Camino el Caminando, it's wonderful. It is a conversation between Paulo Freire and Miles Horton, who is one of the most important leaders in the US civil rights movement. So the two of them have very unique perspectives on social change, and that concept of how we do social change together in conversation is what inspires me today. So let's begin with some shared language. Some of you may know that the system of graduate education in the United States generally awards 3 types of degrees. Master's degrees, which can be either Masters of Arts or Masters of Science, doctoral degrees, which typically are PhDs, or professional degrees. And this can be everything from an education doctorate to a law degree to a medical degree. But in contrast to the PhD, they are really designed for professional training. One of the important ways that these degrees vary is in how students are funded. We try to enroll as many master's students as possible in universities often because the tuition dollars that they pay go directly to help fund a variety of other types of services, sometimes including the PhD programs themselves. Professional degrees, students often pay as well, but those are usually more self-supporting. Master's degrees sometimes are earned along the way to a PhD in the United States, and increasingly so. But for a doctoral degree, that's about as high as you can go. A PhD is what they say the end degree. And it is required now for professors in the United States, except for some teaching professors in some universities. Professional degrees, on the other hand, are often earned on their own. I think unlike in Chile, where you can go directly from high school into a law school, you still need an undergraduate degree, and I thank Daniela for teaching me that yesterday. But you still do have to get on its own as opposed to with a master's degree. So the equity issues that emerge in these programs are pretty different from one another. Because master's degrees are both very common and very expensive, affordability is a major equity concern. For PhD programs, selectivity is the issue. Often there are many more applicants to PhD programs than there are people who can be admitted. And so the fight for access is one that is a very common focus of attention in the United States. And I'll be talking about that. Increasingly, our concern with professional degrees is that they are necessary for a lot of basic jobs, whether it is social work, whether it is medical school, pharmacy, but again, people have to pay on their own, so you have both affordability and selectivity concerns. My research over the years has been focused on selective sectors of higher education, including graduate school, but also universities that are quite selective, and then also science and engineering fields, which often do not have as much access as other majors in the United States. So with those kind of big picture issues in mind, I want to highlight an important difference between diversity and equity. In the United States, these conversations are sometimes conflated, and by putting them together, we often make mistakes in developing solutions to the absence of diversity or the absence of equity. Put most simply, diversity is the presence of difference. So we have diversity of many types in this room right now. we would probably have to have a different assessment to see what is the status of equity. You can't necessarily determine the presence of diversity as an indicator of equity, although sometimes that is the case. In my last book, I defined equity as changing structures, cultures, and systems to empower marginalized groups and close disparities. And the reason that I am focusing on changing cultures, structures, and systems as part of equity is because within the conversation about diversity in American higher education, the Supreme Court has increasingly restricted the ways that we can talk about diversity. They have effectively taken an equity conversation off of the table. At the end of the civil rights movement, diversity was really seen as something that we should pursue for a moral and social good. It was understood to be a signal of equity. It was understood to be important for the labor market. And it was understood to be necessary for social mobility, expanding the technical workforce, and the middle class. But in 1978, the Supreme Court said, we will not allow affirmative action under the moral and social good argument. We will not allow affirmative action on the basis of equity. Instead, we will only allow affirmative action for educational benefits of diversity. And there are, indeed, many benefits of learning in a diverse environment that are important to highlight. Over time, we've also started to see more of a sort of business case for diversity pop up in higher education. There is plenty of evidence, for example, that most students prefer learning in diverse environments. In graduate education, many of us have probably seen the value of being a part of a diverse research team. I saw a really lovely example yesterday of of Carolina and Daniela and Sergio and Connie, each bringing different perspectives on PH Boundaries project. And that project, no doubt, would be weaker if it did not have their different perspectives, their different styles, and their different backgrounds. And then finally, I don't know about Chile, but in the United States, there is growing evidence that organizations and communities are much healthier when they are diverse. In the United States, as an example of this, the military has found that they have a lot more arguments when they do not have diversity in their leadership. And as a result of this, they've been trying to allow for the encouragement of diversity at all levels of the military. So, meanwhile, there continued to be a common way of talking about equity, which is really about gaps in access to important opportunities in the United States. In terms of higher education, one of the ways to capture this that we often see in the research is to show the percentage of degrees that are awarded to populations who are historically underrepresented. So Black, Latino, and Indigenous students in math, for example, are increasingly underrepresented. If you look at the orange versus the gray versus the purple bar, you can see there is a drop-off in the percentage and the number of students in all fields except for material science in the number of students from these groups who are earning degrees. The number that is above the purple in each is how many additional PhDs would be needed per year to close the gap from the purple up to the orange. That's an interesting number and might be one indicator of equity. However, the y-axis on the left, you can see, ends at 20%. And that 20% is significantly lower than the total number of Black, Latino, and Indigenous people in the United States, which is about 35%. So you could argue that even at the baccalaureate level, at the orange level, at the bachelor's level, we do not yet have equity. With respect to gender equity, there has been some improvement over time. You can see 50% is second from the top of the y-axis, but only in biological and biomedical sciences have they reached gender equity in the science and engineering disciplines. Physics continues to be a field that suffers the most in this area in the United States, although there are a lot of good efforts underway to try to change this. And then, for those of you who may be familiar with the theory of intersectionality, which talks about the connections between systems of power that are racial and gender in nature, you can see huge differences between the percentages of people who are underrepresented because they are both women and who identify as either Black, Latino, or Indigenous within the United States. Obviously, this is a really important problem, and the National Academies have been paying close attention to this since 2005. Most recently, their 2023 report, which I was fortunate to be a member of the consensus study in, argued very specifically that we need to pay more attention to the gatekeeping systems. By gatekeeping, I'm talking about the systems of access to the disciplines, to higher education in general. Many of the rules by which we have been determining who deserves access to higher education in the United States have been tilted toward populations who are already overrepresented. And I will share some examples of how that is the case. So they have made an argument that we should be investing in the improvement of graduate education generally, but specifically in how we select and mentor students. One of my dear colleagues and mentors is Estella Ben-Simon. Some of you may be familiar with her work, and she has developed a framework for equity-mindedness. The framework of equity-mindedness that she offers is the perspective that is represented by practitioners who notice inequalities, and I have translated this for you, by the way, take responsibility for those inequities rather than just attributing them to students themselves, and who are willing to respond to and change their practices as they recognize those practices as producing the inequalities. They also highlight the importance of being conscious of the inequities within the systems of higher education and society. So, for example, in addition to being able to pay attention to the data and take institutional responsibility, recognizing that systems have been unfair before you get to a point where you see inequality is part of how you begin to address those inequalities. But each and every one of us can bring a little bit more equity-mindedness to the work that we are doing, and I'm convinced that this is one of the ways that we will make the road by walking. It may not necessarily be clear to us on a given day what that set of conversations will hold, but as we bring equity-mindedness to the conversations and decisions of which we are part, we can no doubt in small and meaningful ways begin to address it. So, an equity-minded mindset is a good indicator of a culture. Some organizations do have more attention to inequalities than others. And a simple definition of culture is the inherited values, goals, and language that provide members with shared identity and purpose. So if we took 30 seconds, we could pause and think about what are the inherited values that you picked up when you were in college? What are you learning, or what have you learned that you might need to unlearn because it is not necessarily a value that is consistent with equity-mindedness? Cultures are important because they help drive systems. And systems are defined as a set of elements that are connected by interactions, both internally as well as with the environment, that help to achieve something. That's a little complicated, so let's break it down. So we could take any system, including the climate system, and begin to recognize how factors within it are producing sort of feedbacks and relationships that either keep it going in a single direction or that change it into a new direction. And so if you want to change a system, one of the best ways to do it is through what we call an exogenous shock. And all of us lived through an exogenous shock in 2020, when COVID-19 disrupted all of the systems that we thought were going. A tiny little virus has the potential to have significant power, and in the same ways, small changes like our use of language, our decision to interrupt a biased comment from a colleague, or perhaps the decision to change a single rule in a system of access can really change how a system operates. With respect to graduate education as a system, I've been in a number of meetings recently where I've asked people to say, what do you think are the purposes of the system of graduate education? And I got these 5 most frequent responses. Number 1, producing the next generation of scholars. No doubt, that's something we want to do through advanced training. Number 2, student learning. That's good. We still want to have some education in doctoral education. Number 3, advancing knowledge. You know, every PhD comes with a dissertation that hopefully advances knowledge. But then number 4 and 5, I think, are very real. In the United States, graduate students supply inexpensive labor for universities in the form of research assistants and teaching assistants. And as a result of this, some of you may know that there is a massive movement toward the unionization of graduate students in the United States. Literally, as I am speaking at USC right now, my dean of the graduate school, I'm lucky to be the associate dean right now, is in a collective bargaining agreement with our new graduate student union to determine what the contract will look like and how much we will be paying graduate students at the end of the year, because indeed, especially in a city like Los Angeles, what it takes to survive is often more than what we have been paying graduate students. So, depending on how cynical you are, you may see some of these as more or less important to the system of graduate education. Nevertheless, the whole system will have problems if we don't acknowledge that these are all factors. So I want to take a moment to just give you a chance to review what you see here as examples of cultural and systemic change, because they are related, but they are different. And I'm going to be spending more time in the second part of my talk talking about examples of systemic change. So take just a moment to review this. Probably the most two important things that I think I've done professionally are helping to make new behaviors and preferences the norm in PhD admissions in the United States, and helping to create levers that will affect large portions of a system. So I think often when we are thinking about social change activities and reducing inequalities, it does take a combination of changing cultures and changing systems. What that requires in practice is a recognition of where we've been off, where we've been misaligned between what we say is important to us and what we actually do. In the case of graduate admissions, one of the things that I was trying to understand in the research study that I was doing is why faculty conduct admissions in practice in ways that undermine the value that they say they have on diversity. And what I found for this tension between merit and diversity is that, number one, some of the common criteria that we use to select PhD students have really deep meanings that are connected to scholars' identities. In the research that I was doing, it was within high prestige departments. And so they also really saw themselves as being prestigious scholars. It wasn't just that they were looking for other scholars, they were looking for people who belonged in departments like their own. But it wasn't just the criteria, which get a lot of attention in the United States. It was also that they demonstrated a clear preference for a sort of selection process that would be marked by efficiency, get the job done quickly, and collegiality, which is a fundamental value in higher education. And as a result, they would use numbers as a way to have their arguments. One person could rate an applicant a 1, another could rate an applicant a 5, and they would say, oh, it's a 2 this person's a 2.5 or a 3, and we don't have to talk about the fact that we fundamentally disagree about the merits of this applicant. Third, I found a pattern that within sociology you might expect, that faculty tend to prefer applicants who are like themselves on some dimension. There were 4 different ways that I found this in the United States, one of which, interestingly, was that faculty who were from outside the United States saw themselves as advocates for applicants who were also from outside the United States, because there is a bias in the US for domestic students. But finally, another reason for this tension between relying on characteristics of merit that undermine diversity is faculty are a little uneasy about any sort of change at all, especially change that's required around race and gender, because the truth is they don't often have the conversations about those issues that make it normal for them to discuss. And so it feels high stakes, it feels tense, and as a result, they would just prefer not to have the conversation at all. So I'll share a little bit with you about what a typical PhD admissions process looks like in the United States. And I recognize that this isn't necessarily one of the most urgent challenges for you all, that there are different challenges, but if you stay with me, I promise we will get to the salient parts for the system of graduate education here. So what typically happens is in PhD programs in the United States, they will get a huge pile of applications. It can be 50, it can be 200, it can be 1,000, you never really know exactly. But the way that what merit or excellence is defined when they're looking at that big pile of applications are people who have already been academically successful, because they assume that this is the best indicator of future success. For the purposes of indicating that excellence, I heard over and over again people talk about the numbers, which generally are about grades as well as GRE scores. And to the extent that they could, they would try to contextualize grades by how prestigious their institution had been and how rigorous they felt their curriculum had been. Now, if what you're concerned about is how merit is undermining diversity, we have a real problem here, because the way that grades and GRE scores are distributed in the United States is heavily racialized and gendered. What you see in front of you here are the GRE quantitative scores in the physical sciences. How many physical scientists do we have in the room? Anyone from physics? One bold member to raise their hand. Yeah, it's one of the fields that does have the most challenges in this regard. Across the bottom, you can see Asian American, white, other Hispanic, Mexican American, Native American, African American, Puerto Rican, and then on the right, men and women. And the orange and blue lines that you see are basically the 25th to 75th percentile of scores. So you can imagine a sort of curve jumping off the page at you. The problem with these distributions and the admissions process is that within physics, there are ways of tracking what the common cutoff scores are to gain access to physics programs. And through a really nice study by my colleagues Casey Miller and Kayvon Stassen, they were able to calculate that the most common cutoff score was a 700. And when that cutoff score is applied, look what happens. You have basically eliminated all applicants who are Native American, African American, Puerto Rican, and significantly more women and men. So what looks like a neutral standard for merit or excellence is actually something that is helping to reproduce inequalities. The irony is, once they are not looking at the full pile of applicants anymore, but rather at their short list, they use very different factors to make decisions. Here they are thinking about the future of the discipline, an applicant's experience with research, their dispositions for research, as well as the kind of perspectives that they're going to bring. Diversity here is fundamental. However, in many cases, they are less concerned with racial and gender diversity than with the sort of unique perspective that someone might offer. There are also, unfortunately, many cases where what they are looking for in terms of diversity can be sort of exoticized. So, for example, an applicant from Malaysia would be viewed as more interesting and important than another applicant from China or India, from whom they receive many applications, even though there is zero evidence that that is actually going to change the learning environment. So, this approach has a variety of problems. Number one, it reproduces inequality of various sorts. Number two, there are a host of false assumptions that I do not have time to share the evidence from the research with you about underlying it. Three, there are lots of biases that are baked into this system, both individual biases with how their applications are being judged, but also structural biases like the use of a criterion that systematically excludes certain populations. This is also part of a larger pattern of over-reliance on metrics without considering the fact that most metrics, all metrics actually, are statistics. Statistics have error. And if they are not thinking about the error, then they are treating it like a more precise indicator than they should be. And then finally, perhaps the most troubling part of this is that the system doesn't actually identify students who consistently are successful. I don't have it up here today, but in the United States, more than 50% of applicants do not finish 50% of admitted students do not actually finish their programs. So we have a problem with selection and then with retention as well. So much of my work for the last several years has been working to develop a consortium of individuals, graduate programs, and universities across the country who are trying to develop a better way. Together, we are learning to make the road to a more equitable approach to admissions. And the framework for equity-minded holistic review that we have developed is centered on the idea that we need to pay attention not only to what criteria we require, but the sequence that we require them in, how we use them, and why we want to see those qualities in the first place. If we're not thinking about why we want to see those qualities, we're missing the opportunity to have a conversation about culture. And so the elements of this framework that we offer are, number one, an application should be looked at for a comprehensive set of criteria using numerous and diverse things that think about a number of aspects of their identity and what they can bring. It should be contextualized. We're not just looking at information on the page, but we want to understand why they have the file that they do. And keep in mind that equity-mindedness perspective, that there are systemic factors out there that are producing the differences that we see in who looks excellent on paper. A major element of the need for improvement in US admissions, I don't know how it is in Chile, is the need for something that is a little bit more systematic. There is a lot of informality that actually is part of the problem of inequality in the United States. And then underlying all of this, of course, is the importance of remembering that it is part of a system of inequality within the United States. So holistic review was originally introduced into the United States through the Supreme Court in 2003 when the University of Michigan was trying to defend its admissions system. And they define it as assessment of academic ability, coupled with a flexible assessment of applicants' talents, experiences, and potential to contribute to the learning of those around them by evaluating all of the information available in their file. Research since then has been looking at a variety of benefits and drawbacks that it has. It's helpful in looking beyond socioeconomic and gender and racial disparities. It's helpful in bringing into better alignment the way that we do admissions with what we say is important to us. It's also helpful in being able to capture more of the non-academic but professionally important skills that we are looking for in the next generation of professionals. And finally, it helps to shift whoever is selected next. And this is what we call the opportunity structure. So if part of the problem with typical admissions is that it tends to anchor on metrics that have inequalities and limited predictive validity, equity-minded admissions is useful in thinking about a more comprehensive set of criteria. If part of the typical problem is that we've been overlooking the unequal opportunities students have had, the barriers and the privileges, contextualization is useful by putting those achievements into perspective. If part of the problem has been that we don't have a consistency and structure, developing some systematic elements that are helping to provide clarity about the structures of admissions and the process of file review represents an improvement. And then finally, for so many of the universities and graduate programs out there that say they are committed to these values, equity-minded admissions helps to make that more straightforward. So how have we been doing this? I want to tell you about two different efforts that are sort of similar but quite different from each other. And I hope as you are listening to these, you'll be thinking about the networks that you are a part of and whom you might work with in ways that you are not working with to help manage the equity issues that are present in your institution, but also in your city, in your country, and beyond. So the Inclusive Graduate Education Network is a really interesting collaboration among disciplinary societies in chemistry, geology, physics, astronomy, and materials research. We also just this summer added the American Mathematical Society onto this. And all of these societies have decided that they are willing to do some work together to think about how to reach faculty. And this has a lot of potential because societies have important norm-setting roles within professions. And if a society is part of determining who gets to be on an annual meeting agenda or determining who gets published, and they begin to have a more strong say about the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then there's some real potential for that there. So I lead the research hub of this effort. I've helped to develop our holistic admissions approach with this, and also provide some coaching and consultation to the society staff as they think about the complexity of reaching faculty. What I've spent more time on is developing the Equity in Graduate Education Consortium, which similarly is trying to reach faculty, but it does it by collaborating specifically with universities and PhD programs within them. So EGE, as we sometimes call it, is a learning community that's trying to build faculty members' skills and knowledge and abilities to promote positive change. We provide training and resources on equitable practices. We provide coaching for PhD programs and their leaders. We focus on organizations that are ready for change as opposed to those that are the most problematic. I think any academic leader knows that there's going to be variation among units in who the problematic actors are, and we are not actually designed for reaching the most challenging ones. We've decided to invest our energy in those that are looking for support. And then finally, a really critical part of what we do is conducting and translating research so that the social science of these issues is available to anybody, not just social scientists. So we started out with 6 universities in California, because California already had a ban on affirmative action, on race-conscious admissions, and we anticipated that in some time there would be a similar sort of national ban, which there now is. So we developed this model, and it's now national, and we will be adding 10 universities in 2024. And the way that it works is that we sort of operate as the hub, that dark black. And then each of the 6 campuses, this would be one cohort of university partners, identifies 2 people. And we purposely have 2 people so that if one person leaves or one person's sick for a month or goes on maternity leave or something like that, then the whole thing at the institution doesn't fall apart. They then create a little learning community of their own, but they're also building out institutional partners. We work with 6 to 8 programs per university that have been identified as ready for change. And then over time, we start to see connections develop between them. For example, the geologists at University of California, Santa Barbara and University of California, San Diego, they knew each other from previous work. And so they now have a little spin-off project that they've brought back to their disciplinary society. But within each of these, we identify the partnerships. We develop teams on each campus, and then every one of them goes through a series of workshops that are designed to help them interrupt their assumptions about how practice is typically done, to evaluate how they do and why they do what they do, to create new policies and practices, and then we provide support for helping them implement that changes. We also have regular meetings among the campus liaisons. We also hold public events on a regular basis so that anybody who's interested can get involved. And then, of course, because I'm a higher ed scholar, we have to conduct research and evaluation on how all of this is working. We also would offer each campus the chance to focus in one area at a time. Because what research tells us is that regardless of what your issues are, you probably have an area where you can improve. So we started with admissions and recruitment, and what you see in the larger boxes on each of these are the names of the workshops for each. We've added a mentoring and well-being track. In the United States, mental health of graduate students is a really significant concern, and one of the understudied aspects of it is the ways that faculty mentors, who are supposed to be advocates and supports, often are part of the problem. So we're helping to correct that. And then finally, as a result of the Supreme Court's decision this summer, we're now creating a new track that's looking more about creating equitable selection systems that are carefully aligned to legal concerns as well as our values. And the way these things work in practice is that we start with presenting research that challenges some of the false assumptions that have been underlying practice, like, for example, the assumption that applicants who come with high GRE scores are more successful, the assumption that, for example, the current process is producing positive outcomes. This is useful because then people feel more motivated to change. Then faculty go back to their campuses and engage in some reflection and some dialogue to identify necessary changes in their department specifically. They come back for another opportunity to learn and some more collective discussion across all of our campuses. And they start to hear, oh, at Columbia, they're doing this. Oh, at Cornell, they're doing that. And so the sharing both is useful in providing ideas, but also produces some positive peer pressure, where they begin to take notice that other elite institutions are acting in a particular way. Meanwhile, we try to provide some tools and resources that help make the change process more feasible. And then they begin to share resources with others on their own campus. So the goal is really to operate as a learning community that is working at multiple levels. So how's it going? The truth is it's awesome, and I'm really proud of this work, even though it is challenging, and we face new challenges literally every month as a result of the changing context that we're working in. What we found is that the PhD programs who are partners in our efforts are using new recruitment and admissions practices. They're doing the equity-minded holistic review on their own terms. They are increasing the number and the percentages of women and minorities who are applying, being admitted, and enrolling, and they're sustaining changes. Universities have expressed that it's been a powerful opportunity for leadership development. It's not uncommon for people who become department chairs or deans or other upper administrators to do it because they were good scholars, not necessarily because they were good managers. And so providing some professional development in this area has been useful. We have also found an encouragement to continue focusing on change-ready organizations because we spend so much of our time focusing on the problems that we haven't often invested in those that are actually ready to make positive change. And then we found that the departments who participated made 3 common changes. Number 1, they started to recognize how their criteria were causing equity problems. Second, they implemented evaluation rubrics as a way to begin systematically looking at their files. And then they learned new habits of mind when they were looking at applications. They could think more systematically, not only across different criteria, but they could learn to see, for example, that if an applicant didn't have a perfect grade point average, they might look to see, were they having to work 20 hours a week? Were they having to work 40 hours a week? What were the other demands that help explain what the pattern of excellence actually is like for that individual? So contextualization is extremely important, and there's a lot of research I could share with you about that. It is so important that in England, they call affirmative action contextualized admissions. And because of the parallels in our work, a group of 6 universities in England have come together and they are now replicating this consortium there. It's called the Yorkshire Consortium for Equitable Doctoral Education. So we're excited to see that you don't have to have exactly the same context to potentially learn how to learn together. And this takes me back to the quote that I started with, that we make the road by walking. Nosotros hacemos el camino caminando. So the question, what is the road? In our case, we've learned that the road we're trying to make is learning and change in community. Academia is really good at rewarding geniuses. Academia is really not good at acknowledging when there's learning to be done. In fact, it's not uncommon when we're trying to make admissions decisions to admit people who come with much of the knowledge that our programs exist to provide. So recognizing that it's okay to be a learner, it's okay to be needing change as opposed to being successful in it. The road that we're trying to make is about critical consciousness and equity-mindedness, because we do see that as people begin to have those habits of mind as part of what it means to be a professional, that they make different decisions. They begin to be more relational instead of transactional. And then finally, continuous learning and continuous adaptation instead of thinking about equity as something that we do and then check and then move on to something else is also proven to be very important. One of the other implications for this work for us is that we do need to have continuous development in what professional development topics we're addressing. It is not uncommon for us to recognize by being in meetings with people that there is something that is percolating, something that is really brewing that people are looking for support on, and that as social scientists we might be able to provide without a whole lot of effort some support in that area. And then finally, I don't know how much organizational learning and organizational change work is formally a part of what your institutions are doing, but we have seen that when you bring together the value of individuals changing what they do with organizations changing what they do, it's a very helpful way to change cultures and systems, to rethink the norms that are underlying our practices, but also rethinking the sort of rules to which our systems are addressed. So I want to close by acknowledging my team, acknowledging and thanking them for inspiring me daily. One of the things that we talk about sometimes is that we as a team are caught up in the system that we inherited, and that we are committed to operating with one another in a way that is more humane, that is more supportive than the rules of the game that are currently in play. And I guess I would leave you with the same message, that we might not like the systems that we have inherited, but they are the ones that we have inherited now. And either we can give some attention to them and improve them for the next generation, or they can look back on us and complain about the systems that we left them as well. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions if we have time for that. Even a microphone.
Thank you, Julie, for your presentation. Very inspiring. See? I see. Okay. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation. Very inspiring what you just present. I was wondering if you can give us some suggestions or on how we can start building, for instance, a consortium. How did you start this consortium? Like I was listening and I was wondering, there is a lot of work behind that, but also I believe that our resources too.
Indeed.
Yeah, so if you could expand how we could start something similar
Yes,
in a country like Chile.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The model that we used is called a networked improvement community. It's also known as a NIC. And the philosophy behind the NIC is common challenges, local solutions. So I think the first step is to be in sufficient conversation and be real with each other about what your challenges are, to consider what challenges you might be able to better address with one another than on your own. And some of it has to do with existing relationships too. So when we first started the consortium, I knew the deans of the graduate school at each of the universities and was able to say, hey, I've been seeing through invitations to speak at your institutions that you are all thinking about these admissions challenges, these equity challenges. Would you like to have a conversation about whether we should formalize our efforts in this area? And when they said yes, the first thing that we did, and this is your question about resources, was to go after a grant. So we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to do a pilot. And so basically working with both the trust that we had and the relationships, but also the willingness to be honest about our challenges was the first step. I would say also that something I like about the NIC is it doesn't force people to use the same solutions. So that holistic review framework that I gave you, you should see how differently it is applied on the different campuses based on their institutional rules, their resources. For example, University of California, Davis, they have a whole system for faculty professional development already. UC Santa Barbara had a lot of interest, but no faculty development. So they were starting in a very different place. So I think acknowledging that in those common challenges, people are going to be in different places with the solutions, and you still care about each other, you still work with each other, even if you don't have exactly the same need at the same moment. So yeah, I think those are the three main things I would say. Number one, know what the common challenges are, be in conversation about the realities of them, get the money you need for the time, because this does take time and effort. And then finally, give each other freedom to develop your own approaches to solving them. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Yuli, for your presentation. Very interesting. I wonder to what extent you can reconcile these changes with the changes in the law framework you have had in the US, because apparently the law framework is going backwards, whereas you want to move forward.
Well, here's the irony. There was already a lot of work that needed to be done before the Supreme Court's changes. So in California, they have a law called California Proposition 209 that is basically like the ban on affirmative action, the ban on race-conscious admissions. So we developed that framework for holistic review with 209 in mind. So it was already compliant with the law. And now we are, we've had to make some slight changes because of the Supreme Court's, the differences that its decision makes, but there hasn't actually been that much change. So I do think maybe part of the solution is be mindful of what's on the horizon and not just the challenges that are right in front of us. But yeah, honestly, I think the bigger challenge right now is more around unionization and how faculty are rethinking their role It's created a little bit of an existential crisis, I think, on a lot of universities, because that faculty-student relationship that they just sort of took for granted is like, I can be your advisor and your supervisor and your mentor and your sponsor. It's been complicated now by the fact that, no, I'm really more like your employer because we are in a contract. So I think that's been more challenging than the legal shifts in the US. And it will continue to be, because one thing we are learning is that during the unionization process, there are stressors created by the strikes and by the unionization process. And then once you have a contract in place, there are new stressors created by renegotiating the relationship between an advisor and a student. So yeah, I think it's part of the road sometimes needs a detour. Oh, good.
I have a question here from Professor from Universidad del Paraíso. Yes, we are encouraged to show that we are working towards equity in our institutions or our programs. However, they do so by looking at numeric indicators. For example, the percentage of women that we have in our programs. Aren't they making the same mistake of not being holistic by not taking into account the context or other circumstances that may make this goal impossible to reach right away?
I love this question. Yeah, so I mentioned that I'm inspired by tensions, right? And I think a lot of people do make the mistake of reducing something as deep and complex as equity to a single indicator. And that, oh, if we just close the bars on the bar chart, everything will be better, without paying attention to the lived experiences of people. And I think especially, every day it seems like there's something in the news in the United States about the kind of ways that you can have changes in statistics, but still have very deep changes needed in the quality of experiences, the quality of climate. So, yeah, as to the question about whether it's just using North American norms to define it, I would say absolutely. That maybe that's part of the challenge from the beginning, is to say, what are the common challenges here and now for us? Statistics have always been helpful in doing that, but it's a very northern, Western, sort of neoliberal way of thinking about what progress looks like. Just change the numbers. So I really appreciate that question, and think that having a critical perspective about power, for example, and the dynamics of power that are meaningful in a given university or a given discipline is very important. I would love to hear what recreations of the problem and recreations of the solution would be developed by somebody who asks a question like that. Yes?
Here?
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. You mentioned a 50% graduation rate in doctoral programs. Has this program had any effects on that, on graduation rates of underrepresented, perhaps minority students?
That's a great question. So we were just formed in 2018, and most programs began making changes in 2020. So I don't have those numbers yet, but I do have a meeting with our evaluation team next week, and I'm going to ask them if they have the ability to start collecting that data. Thank you so much for asking that question. I think we, with what I shared with you there, the intervention, so to speak, was about changing the admissions process. It wasn't about changing the department culture or mentoring. What I think most of the research on higher education, as you would know, would say is that it takes both, right? The equity-minded perspectives that people carry around, or the lack of it, don't only show up in admissions, they show in how we interact with students. One of the big problems in the US is what they call a deficit mindset, where students who are being considered are not looked at positively if they are bringing strengths that are different than their norm. So for example, if you have had significant barriers in your life, you probably have assets and abilities that are going to serve you well as a graduate student that are different than those a student who had every advantage available to them, and then that's their strength. So we are definitely working on that now with our new track on mentoring and well-being. But yeah, we have been thinking about what are the different indicators of success for different kinds of faculty learning, and would it be possible to expect that there should be changes in retention or degree completion when a different mindset toward admissions is used? I think it's more likely to see changes to that when different mentoring practices are used than admissions. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think it's a mixture of the admissions, but the mentoring would be more important. But perhaps admissions would carry over to the culture of the program.
Right. So one of the powers of this perspective is how these elements that you see in the gears, they can be applied to your teaching practice, they can be applied to your budgeting, they can be applied to all kinds of areas of work. And in the book that I edited with Adriana Kizar, we really did want to be able to highlight how it doesn't really matter what your job is. You can begin to think in these ways that are more critically conscious, and as a result, carry out your work with greater awareness of its implications for equity.
So I was wondering, because you were talking about all the different education institutions that were involved, I was wondering how willing were these educational institutions to make these changes, and if there were any difference between public and private institutions. Because, for example, here in Chile, we do have a lot of differences, and they can be really huge in implementing changes.
Yeah, we did see changes. We do see changes. We will see changes between public and private. But what we also see is that they have different strengths. So, for example, private universities often have more flexibility. Part of being private is they don't have to be accountable to the public in the same way, and so they can move a little bit more easily. Public universities, because they are accountable to the public, sometimes are more bold. So one example of how we see this play out is our public, if you imagine we operate as a learning community. So if part of what we do is learning and part of what we do is provide community, we tend to find that the public universities are more interested in the community part, and the private universities are more interested in the learning part. And they're the ones who are in the private institutions, they're kind of okay with doing it on their own. They might not have the same history of working together on these issues, but they do want to do it better. They really want to do it better. And similarly, public universities, because they are often part of a system, they're used to working together. They like working together, and so they like the learning. And then there are those, delightful people at the center of it who are really there for the learning community, and they appreciate both elements of it. So thank you for that question.
Would you say that there is a different proportion then on the public and the private?
In the total membership?
Yes.
Let me see. I'm going to see my logos. Here we go. All right. So private, public, 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 private, 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 public, private, public, private, private. It's pretty balanced right now. Yeah, I think as of 2024, the 10 new members that we are bringing in are about 60%. So we are increasingly more public. But the private universities, they are very proud and happy to finally have some colleagues who are working on these areas. Often they don't have the same amount of sources of support that the public universities do.
So along the same lines of the previous question, right? Would you say there are differences? I'm not sure this is pertinent, but have you looked at this only for PhD programs or also for master's program? Are there differences in what you're observing there?
Sí.
And is it mainly related to the funding sources and how funding is playing out? So
Yeah.
what can we learn from that?
No, it's a good question. So during our pilot, when it was just the California institutions, it was only PhD programs. In some ways, that made it easier because of, they did tend to share more of the similar types of challenges. But we heard loud and clear from our partners that they knew there was work to do in the master's programs as well. And so we have opened it up to both. The challenges with equity in our master's programs do go back to that question of funding, because they sort of recognize that it's a bit of a misnomer to say, oh, we have equitable access because the admissions criteria and process is fair, but it's not equitable access if you can only afford to participate if you have family wealth or significant loans that you are willing to take out. So I think it's one of the ways that we've seen our teams need to work with other offices on campus as they are starting to do more around master's students, where they're realizing they can't do this work without financial aid. They can't do this work without the scholarships and grants offices. So it's more complicated, but I think it's probably also more authentic to where the equity gaps are in our system.
I was going to ask in the same line, because here the challenge will be funding, actually, because it all comes from one agency.
Yes.
And so, which is a need. And if they don't share this, then we have a problem. So I think we have to not just build a consortium, but go to a need and ask for the program. We have had experiences of equity programs in graduate studies in Chile, very important ones. One was the Equal Opportunity Scholarships. Actually, it was the American Embassy with Fulbright that started this about 15 years ago, and Condoleezza Rice.
Oh, that's right.
She was behind it. And that was very, very important, and it has had an impact in Chile. And also a Ford Foundation funded program called Equitas. And then we have all the universities moved quite along in undergraduate equity programs. We started about 12 years ago. Stella Ben-Simon has been actually very inspiring for that, and Silvia Hurtado and so on, in California.
Great scholars.
Yeah. And but here, the big challenge is funding, because it all comes from the same source, and if they do not share these principles, then we will have a problem. So we have to move with a need.
Yeah, diversified funding streams has turned out to be something that our master's programs are really working toward together in some cases, where they are realizing they hadn't been maybe doing all that they could with private funders or small-scale scholarships that might be for only 1 or 2 additional people per year per program, but that overall could make a significant difference. So yeah, I think for public universities in particular, diversifying the sources of support for graduate students through creative fundraising, capital campaign. I mean, like they are very creative across the 12 institutions. I will say only maybe half of them are thinking seriously about the master's program funding issue right now. And I'll be honest, I think a few who are not broaching it are because they do feel that it's just so difficult. It is so structural. It is just baked into the system that this is a barrier, that they feel like it's going to take a different sort of strategy than what this particular program offers. So I think that's a worthwhile thing, is that the things that involve faculty practice, and there's a lot that demands better faculty practice, this approach is really useful. But when you have deep structural issues like what you're describing, this would need to be in parallel with solutions and strategy on that level. Thank you for acknowledging that.
Well, maybe I will have the power of the last question. When you go across programs here in Chile, or when you ask people across this university, which is large and has a great variety of programs, you see different levels of equity-minded.
Sure.
Right? Different levels across the table. And you use the word change-ready. Like we will work with those who are change-ready. So my question is, how do you know when you are change-ready, or a group or an individual is change-ready? That's one question. And how do you think or approach those who are not change-ready yet, or those places where the equity-mindedness is so low or it doesn't exist at all?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect question to end on. So I heard two parts of it. So number one, how do you know when a person or an organization is change-ready or change-ready enough? For us, we've got three indicators. Number one, there's some ability to articulate that they have an equity problem that they have some responsibility for. The second is that there's some evidence that they've begun to do some work in this area, so that this isn't going to be like, as we say in the United States, their first rodeo. And then third, they have sufficient leadership for it. And we have seen time and again that you can have a dean who speaks really, really well, but if there aren't people on the ground who are similarly committed to this and who have sufficient bandwidth or time in their schedules to do the work, it will fail. In fact, we had one institution, I won't tell you which one, where we went from having 4 partners down to 2 partners because the dean was very, very optimistic that these 4 partners would all be really engaged, but it turned out they just didn't have the time. They were committed. So we count that as part of what it means to be change ready too. They're not just ready in their attitudes, but they're ready for the work. The second part of your question, remind me of what it was.
Those who are not change ready.
Yes. No, absolutely important. And we do see over and over again that there's often more interest in being a part of this than we currently have demand for, both among the institutions that want to participate, and then when we go to a university and say, which do you want your 6 to 8 programs to be, there are like maybe 12 or 14 that think it's a good idea. So we do have quarterly public events that are open to anybody, and those are good places for there to be an additional kind of area of learning that they can begin raising their change readiness. But then also within the workshops that are offered on each campus, the very first one we allow to be open to anybody on the campus. And what we see over and over again is people do kind of come out and surprise us from all corners of the environment, even if it's just 1 or 2 per department. So yeah, and then we also finally have some PDFs and just some sort of like translation guides that we offer that are available to anybody as well. So yeah, I think it's more who gets the more in-depth support, and then who gets the one-on-one coaching and consultation, and who's an official member of the learning community as opposed to like, their institution as a member. But it's challenging, and we don't have any regrets about being selective about it. Because we have seen that in situations where we allowed an institution in where there was more ambition than change readiness, it just didn't go so well, and it was problematic. But we are learning as we go, and we don't want to become so selective that people who are looking for support can't find it where we are.
Well, perfect. Here you are receiving. Darinka is saying many thanks for the fantastic talk. Rodrigo is asking for the Chilean Consortium. And you have more comments like that, but let's give an applause to Julie for your excellent talk. And thank you. Y muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Tenemos un taller con Julie para aquellos que quedaron interesados en profundizar más en estos conceptos. Va a ser el día de jueves y todavía tenemos algunos lugares para inscribirnos. Así que pregúntenos a aquellos que están interesados, manden emails, porque nosotros les vamos a mandar la inscripción. ¿Okay? Muchas gracias, Julia, otra vez, y que tengan buen regreso a casa.